Uh, Good morning. Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to be here as someone who is not an expert in digital technology. I'm a political scientist working in the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace think tank, following general international trends in global democracy. And I was asked to speak to you this morning about the global state of play in global democracy. So I'm aware that this is a very big picture, macro level question compared to the very operational questions that you debate in this forum. But the overall state of democracy in the world is very serious, it's very fluid, and it's very turbulent. And I think it is important for us to understand exactly what is going on in terms of democratic development, because this establishes the overarching political context within which you debate the more effective use of civic technology. So I want to suggest to you this morning the ways in which I think there are important linkages between the overarching state of democracy in the world and the kind of challenges that you face here in making civic technology more effective. Our starting point seems to be very worrying, very sobering. Many analysts today talk about a wholesale democratic recession affecting the world. Authoritarian regimes seem to be very effective and stronger. Democracy in many places of the world seems to be losing traction. So this is the debate that many people are talking about. So we are immediately faced with what appears to be a very disappointing paradox, that in recent years, when the world of civic technology has been developing in very positive and very dynamic ways, the overarching state of democracy in the world seems to be performing rather badly. So this should immediately tell us that the link between the micro and the macro, between personal democracy and overarching institutional or political democracy, is not working as well as it could or should do. And I think that frames the kind of challenges we should be debating today. The nature of the problem affecting global democracy is not a single problem. There are different kinds of problems affecting different types of political systems. Many authoritarian regimes around the world seem to be more firmly rooted in power. They are more resistant to political change. The hopes that many authoritarian regimes would begin to reform politically today seem to be evaporating. In Russia, in Belarus, in Azerbaijan, in many North African and Middle Eastern states. Authoritarian regimes seem to be digging themselves into power more firmly and seem to have found more effective ways of defending themselves against democratic pressure. Perhaps even more disappointingly, many countries that did seem to have made democratic breakthroughs now seem to be sliding backwards into more authoritarian modes of governance. So here we're talking about the likes of Turkey and Egypt and Venezuela. This tells us today that democracy is not an inexorably positive or unilinear process, that countries can make quite significant progress along the road towards better quality democracy and still be vulnerable to very significant regression back into authoritarian modes of governance. And then the third type of political system that should concern us are countries that are neither authoritarian nor democratic, but seem to be today stuck halfway in between the democratic and authoritarian systems. So these are countries like Moldova, Morocco, Jordan, many Balkan states. The hope was that these countries would gradually begin to move towards more fully developed democratic consolidation, whereas today this state of hybrid mixes of authoritarian and democratic dynamics risks becoming almost a permanent state of affairs. So these are different types of challenges facing different types of political regimes. Moreover, we are facing very serious problems in the established democracies themselves. You will all know that the polls show declining levels of trust in political parties, in government institutions, growing problems of the rule of law in many established Western democracies, governments increasingly restricting the freedoms of judicial systems, and over the last couple of years, many opinion polls showing some really very, very worrying signs that many citizens, even in Western established democracies, seem to be shockingly indifferent towards democracy as a core value. So all these trends are very, very preoccupying, and they are serious. They are serious. However, I would argue that there is another side to the equation, and that not everything happening at the international level with democratic development is negative. So we should not exaggerate the extent of this democratic crisis that many analysts are talking about. If you look at the overarching situation, there is a plateau in the number of democracies globally rather than a dramatic collapse. This is the Freedom House scores for political rights. You can see basically fluctuations over the last decade within relatively narrow parameters. The situation with civil rights is slightly more worrying, but again, the fluctuations are taking place within a relatively narrow band of margin. And of course, there are many positive cases around the world. Countries like Gambia, Ghana, Guatemala, Chile, Colombia, Sri Lanka, Nepal, Tunisia, as well as Georgia and Ukraine to some extent closer to home. These are countries that are making at least some progress towards better quality democracy. These are not the cases that tend to hit the headlines when we're talking about Russia and Turkey, but in many parts of the world there is more positive developments in train. Many surveys and polls show that in regions like Asia and Africa and Latin America, support for democratic norms is actually increasing rather than becoming weaker. In Asia and Africa, overall scores of democracy have actually improved in recent years rather than getting worse. So, I do not mean by this to minimize the negative trends we see around the world, but not everything is moving in the wrong direction. There are positive developments as well. And absolutely crucially, even though we see many citizens around the world questioning mainstream forms and channels of democratic representation, we also see scores of political participation actually getting better in many places of the world. So the standard picture of citizens being increasingly indifferent to political participation, I think is actually not quite fitting the picture. You see here, even again from Freedom House, where we have problems with the rule of law getting worse or freedom of expression getting worse, scores of political participation have actually not been performing too badly in recent years. So, the picture I want to leave you with then is that there are both positive trends and negative trends. And I think this nuanced picture matters for your debates here. Why? There are many people who are so negative about the state of global democracy that they argue we should basically give up on all kinds of traditional forms of democratic representation. I think the challenges you face are actually more subtle. There are both positive trends and negative trends, and it seems to me the challenge for civic technology experts is to try to amplify the positive trends while mitigating or tempering the negative trends. In a way, digital technology simply changes the terrain on which democrats and autocrats do battle as they strive to master digital technology. So civic technology is neither inherently good or bad for democracy. It depends entirely on how it is used. And I want to finish off just by making a few very quick suggestions of the ways in which I think civic technology can help maximize the positive trends that exist in some places across the world. First of all, I think the challenge in the next phase of digital technology is to try to feed into, rather than displace, offline collective political action. There is a need for civic tech to try to help nourish group-based active political involvement. There is a need to connect online activism with other types of civil society activity in a much more mutually reinforcing way. So there is a need to dovetail much better, more collective forms of democratic innovation that are happening across the world, the increasingly widespread use of deliberative forms of democratic process, for example. I think here civic technology could be fed into these kinds of innovation in a much more productive way. Second challenge, to expand the kind of issues that civic technology addresses. Civic technology has proved very effective so far in highlighting certain very catchy campaign issues, mobilizing online petitions for particular issues to monitor governments, keep governments to account. It's been less good at looking at the broader issues of democratic reform, the less catchy or less glamorous issues of making trade-offs between different types of political reform. And this is really the challenge we face in deepening democratic quality, and where I think civic technology could and should be playing a far more valuable role. Think that this needs to go beyond simply programs of e-governance. Many regimes around the world have very effective forms of e-governance where civic technology has played a productive role, but at the same time these governments are actually moving backwards or not progressing in terms of their overarching democratic development. Third challenge, to broaden out participation. We all know the standard criticism that civic technology has helped people who are already mobilized politically, but has not got new kinds of people engaged in politics. The figures show this criticism may be slightly unfair, but I think a lot more could be done. And I think the key lesson here is that the digital divide is mirrored by an offline divide in democratic participation as well. And these are two sides of the same coin, and they need to be debated much more as part of a single challenge in the future, rather than the online and offline challenges being debated as if they were different kinds of challenge we face. Fourth issue, the challenge of illiberalism. We all know that many illiberal, even anti-democratic groups are actually becoming more effective in the way that they use digital technology. I think here the question is whether civic tech can help engage any of these groups and movements in a way that's more constructive. The failure of traditional forms of democratic representation to engage some of these nativist, populist organizations so far is actually what is feeding and nourishing the trend of populism in many countries. So I think much more debate and emphasis needs to be invested in this challenge of how we can constructively engage these kinds of illiberal groups to try and put a brake on these trends in populism. Fifth challenge, I think, is how civic technology can move up from the local level. We all know that online tools have been very effective at the local level. This is the comparative advantage of civic technology. In a way, it should not lose that comparative advantage. But I think many political scientists debate the question of whether technology can be scaled up so that it feeds into more national level democratic regeneration. So I think there needs to be much more consideration given into how civic technology can feed into these more systemic level adjustments in democratic design that are so needed. Then the final issue I'd make before concluding is how civic technology can help defend the civic space. I appreciate there will be a lot of debate here in these 2 days about digital security, about pushing back worrying trends in online control. The one point I would make here is that offline civic activity is also facing very serious repression. The space for general civil society activity is being narrowed across the world. And again, these are two parts of the same kind of problem. And I think digital activists need to be allying with mainstream NGOs in a much more productive way to try and push back these restrictions than has been the case so far. So I conclude here with one final, more kind of overarching thought. If we add together these kinds of challenges, I think the overarching conceptual challenge that you face is to debate how civic tech can contribute towards a more combined model of democracy that nourishes both direct democracy but also better representative democracy as well. Whether digital technology can move beyond focusing simply on better quality public management, the better quality management of service delivery, into the kind of big issue democratic debates with which many countries are grappling around the world. I would say that the basic challenge is whether we can engineer a situation where personal democracy and collective democracy can be developed in a much more mutually reinforcing way. And I'll conclude here. Thank you very much.